BP's settlement agreement may have satisfied thousands of victims of the 2010 Gulf of Mexico oil spill, but it hasn't settled many crucial remaining issues. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. It was the worst oil spill in US history. Over the course of 87 days, nearly 5 million barrels spewed into the Gulf of Mexico after the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded in April 2010. The impact on the environment was devastating, both for the people living along the coastline of the Gulf states and the $3 billion fishing industry there. Late last week, the British oil giant BP agreed to pay out $7.8 billion to settle a lawsuit with more than 120,000 victims of the disaster. A trial to determine blame has been postponed. But settlements won't be universally welcomed around the Gulf. Many still want to see BP, Transocean and Halliburton held to account in court. And whatever the outcome, some important issues still remain unanswered. First, the health impact of the chemical dispersants used to break up the oil spill is still unknown. More than 8 million litres of the agents were used. Secondly, there's the environmental damage. While the oil may have visibly cleared from the Gulf, it may be years before ecologists know the full impact of the spill. And despite tough talk from Barack Obama about the need for reform, critics say the US is no more protected today than it was before the BP blowout. Little comfort for the hundreds of thousands of victims of the disaster.
Despite 36 hours of non-stop firefighting, the Deepwater Horizon oil platform sank Thursday in the Gulf of Mexico.
This oil spill went beyond just physical damage. We were threatening ways of life, how people had been grown up and how they were raised, the watermen that operate down here. This is very traumatic to this area.
You had executives of BP and Transocean and Halliburton falling over each other to point the finger of blame at somebody else.
A lot of the waterways where I normally do my business have been shut down.
There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back.
A bigger, snug-fitting cap was placed on the BP well, 1.5 kilometers down on the sea floor.
I want to come here personally and express my gratitude. The Coast Guard, along with other federal agencies and state and local governments, has directed the largest response to an environmental disaster in American history.
Earlier, I spoke to Garrett Graves, who is the chair of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority of Louisiana. I asked him about the long-term effects of the spill on the state and its industries.
Well, yeah, you have to keep in mind that this oil spill is one of the largest oil spills in history. In regard to the volume of oil, and you look at the Gulf of Mexico, it's one of the most productive ecosystems on this continent. You have more fisheries that are harvested commercially and recreationally in this area than anywhere else in the United States. And so when you go across and you look at the volume of oil, you look at the number of miles that were oiled. You had nearly 1,200 miles in the Gulf of Mexico that were oiled, and you look at the duration. We still have in Louisiana today over 20 miles of our shoreline that are moderately and heavily oiled, and we have nearly 200 miles that are still oiled. And so here we are approaching 2 years after the spill, that type of duration in a very productive ecosystem. The impacts are significant.
And as far as restitution is concerned, I mean, this is a very complex legal case. It not only involves BP, it involves other companies as well, Transocean, Halliburton, Cameron International. Are we going to see something here that's going to take years and years, perhaps decades to resolve?
The judge in this case, in my opinion, has been working to try to clear the decks in regard to the apportionment of liability and trying to make determinations of liability among the other parties, such as those you mentioned, the Transoceans, the Halliburtons, the MOEX, and ARCO of the world. I think that he is trying to clear the decks to facilitate quick resolution of this, whether it be done through trial or done through a settlement negotiation, as was done with the private plaintiffs.
Do you think that the mistakes were made, I mean, the safety lapses, the manner in which BP initially handled the oil spill, and also, the fact that the blowout preventer didn't work, do you think those mistakes have been fixed?
It's pretty amazing. You can look back at the Gulf of Mexico and the volume of production that's taken place in the Gulf of Mexico over the last few decades. We produce trillions of cubic feet of natural gas and billions of barrels of oil without any type of spill or safety lapse as we've seen in this situation. You look at some of the email traffic and some of the interviews from folks who are involved in this Macondo well, and you see very much an anomaly. You don't see one smoking gun, you see several smoking guns. And so could safety improve? Absolutely could improve. I think it could always improve, and I think that there have been some improvements, many of them led by the industry. But I think you really have to focus on the anomalies associated with this disaster and focus upon those where one of the federal reports, as I recall, described it as a culture of failures.
So what lessons have been learned from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico? With me to discuss this in the studio is Randa Fahmy Hudome, a former representative of Halliburton. Next to her, Tyler Suitors, a freelance journalist who covered the BP oil spill for the program Energy Now. And from New Orleans, Monique Harden, who's an environmental lawyer and represented several Gulf fishermen. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's go first to New Orleans, to Monique Harden. Monique, we've just been reporting that agreement there. BP agrees to pay $7.8 billion, but of course that's not the end of it, is it?
Well, it's actually not even $7.8 billion. It's that is the figure that BP estimates its settlement payout will be, but according to the plaintiffs who worked on the settlement agreement with BP, there is no maximum cap on the settlement that they've agreed to. We're kind of operating at a loss right now in the Gulf region because we have yet to see the terms of the settlement agreement. That's going to take a few days, as I understand it, from the court. And then that will be followed by a public fairness hearing on the terms of the agreement where folks with objections can raise them.
Okay, well, let's look at this deal, which gives individuals and businesses affected by the 2010 oil spill an estimated, well, as Monique says, it could be different from $7.8 billion, but it's not the end, of course, of BP's legal woes. The agreement doesn't include BP's partners, Transocean, which owned the doomed Deepwater Horizon oil rig, or Halliburton, which provided the rig with construction materials. The companies also face possible criminal and civil penalties with an estimated $65 billion in long-term cleanup costs. Now, those seeking damages from BP and its partners include their investors, U.S. federal and state governments, and workers who helped clean up the spill, not to mention that BP, Halliburton, and Transocean are also suing each other. Long way to go, Randa.
Absolutely long way to go. And I think, you know, there are some lessons learned here, and in particular, not only on the legal front, but the political front as well. And one of them was, remember the Exxon Valdez. In 1989, the Exxon oil company at the time was involved in a horrible spill off the coast of Alaska. And that was lessons on how not to handle it. In this case, I think BP has really stepped up to the plate from day one when it happened. But with respect to Halliburton and Transocean and the other parties involved, I think Anadarko is also 25% owner as well. It is not clear yet who's at fault, but BP has stepped up and accepted the liability and responsibility for this. And in fact, before this settlement was announced with the plaintiff, remember there was the Claims Commission, the Gulf Oil Spill Claims Commission, of which billions of dollars were spent for claims from that prior to the settlement.
Okay, Tyler, has BP stepped up to the plate?
Well, I won't speak for BP itself, but from the outside looking in, it certainly seems like they would be pleased with this recent decision and the settlement. When you're looking at what could have been some kind of expense on BP's part in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The highest number I'd seen was $200 billion. And you're looking at 7.8 for a big chunk of that settlement is already in place, possibly going up to 20 that was already outlaid. It certainly seems like a legal victory for BP, although publicly they've been very clear about saying they want to do the right thing. They have to be pleased with this recent decision. Okay,
Monique, is that a victory for BP in your view?
Well, first of all, I don't think BP has at all stepped up to the plate. You got to keep in mind the history we've had with this disaster. Initially, BP contracted with a company that sold itself, promoted itself for reducing lost dollar payout on claims brought by employees and others who would be harmed by the operations of a company like BP. Relationship that BP had with a company that would work to ensure that people got, less than what they deserved for their damages and injuries was severed, and the Gulf Coast Claims Facility replaced it. And there we still had problems. Number one, with the standard the Gulf Coast Claims Facility had established, it worked in a way that would reject all health illness claims related to the BP disaster, where people had and still suffer from conditions related to exposure to the toxic crude oil and chemical dispersants. And so where we are right now with the settlement agreement, which does have some focus on health claims, is trying to make sure that people in the Gulf region and our environment were all made whole at the end of the day. Recovery is vital in this area, and we've got to make sure that BP is held accountable. What we have to, and we don't have a lot to show for that accountability, where it seemed from the start of this whole process in the aftermath of the disaster that BP was in control of how it would be managed and how it would be handled, not our government, which represents the people here in the region and around the country. And that's been a problem ever since.
Randa, no accountability?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of accountability. Look, when this happened, I think the Obama administration was clearly taken by surprise and did not know what to do, if they could do anything. But when it became apparent that certainly the spill was under control and the well was capped, the Obama administration called in the president of BP. At the time they had a changeover. It's now Bob Dudley. Bob Dudley came to the White House. He was summoned to the White House. He came voluntarily, and they settled on this claims commission, and BP came forward and decided to do this. BP also went up on Capitol Hill, and if you might remember, last year, there was the most comprehensive legislation passed by Congress than we've ever seen on oil spills, and it involved compensation by BP to some of these victims. It included not only health claims, but all the other claims, including environmental claims and the cost of cleanup. It also included trust funds and liability and whatnot. And so I think all stepped along the way, BP has done the right thing, has stepped up to the plate, and has not fought any of this along the way. And so I think to their credit, certainly to their lawyers' credit and the plaintiffs and the legal team who were involved in this settlement, I think one's going to find that everybody gets compensated in a fair manner. This is not, I mean, it's not that BP has an unlimited, resources to be able to provide. This was a mistake. This was accidental. This was not purposeful action on their part.
Yeah, but I mean, the initial investigation showed us that there were problems here. I mean, even, the engineer who was on that rig at the time, just shortly before the explosion took place, knew that there was something wrong. Nothing was done about it. BP does not have a good safety record from what we've gathered.
There were problems, but there's a difference between willfully negligent in the law, and I'm sure Monique can address this. There are certainly a line at which you can prove willful negligence versus pure accidental occurrences. And I think that remains to be seen, what exactly the record was and what exactly they thought the problem was at the time.
And those terms that Randa just mentioned are specific legal terms, and they will help determine just how much more BP is going to pay, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case. Those terms, willful negligence, that has some dollar connotation associated with it, and it is much higher than if you don't prove willful negligence in this case.
Something that Randa said earlier on. Sorry, Monique, you want to say something?
Yeah. The problem that we have is not so much what various laws say in this regard. The problem that we have is we have a company with a tremendous amount of resources that has pulled in away from being the accountable company that your guest speaker describes it as being. When we've got to pay attention to how BP has actually conducted itself in the Gulf region, beginning with first underestimating the amount of barrels of oil being gushing out of the Macondo oil well in the depths of the Gulf of Mexico, followed by working with a company to deny fair compensation for the victims of this disaster, contracting with fisher men and women who've been put out of work by the disaster with terms that would prevent them from having their day in court and suing for damages and seeking rightful compensation that they deserve. This is the BP we have seen in the Gulf region. And when it comes to the cleanup, for people who wanted to wear respirators to protect their health from airborne toxins, there's chemical spraying from small planes. You had burning of the oil. So air pollution was a significant concern. And so for volunteers and cleanup workers who came equipped with heart respirators and breathing devices, they were told by BP representatives that if you wear them at this site, you will be terminated. So that's the kind of company we're talking about here. We're not talking about at all a company as it portrays itself in these commercials as wanting to do the right thing and wanting to be accountable. This is a company that wants to, do the damage that it did in the Gulf of Mexico and not fully compensate or be held accountable for the damage it's done. Those are all facts.
A big question mark there over whether BP acted in good faith.
Well, do they act in good faith? In what part are you talking about? In cleaning up, in providing the money ahead of time to compensate victims?
Being forthcoming
in
about
what they're doing now,
about safety and in cleaning up and in taking responsibility.
Look, I'm sure your viewers know this, but drilling for oil, particularly domestic drilling, and particularly where you're in the deep water, is a risky business. Nobody's saying this is foolproof or safe-proof here. I mean, this is the first major accident we've had since 1989, really since Exxon Valdez. These things are going to happen. This is a risky business. The question is, at what level does BP's responsibility rise to? And all I can say with respect to BP not knowing how much oil was gushing out of the well, neither did the U.S. government. I worked for the U.S. government. I worked for the Department of Energy for many years, and our technology isn't exactly up to snuff. We, the U.S. government, didn't even know how much was gushing from that well. So to expect the company to know more than the U.S. government, I think is a standard higher. And I also think we have to be careful that because BP or any other of these large corporations have the deepest pockets, that somehow they should be responsible for paying for everything. I think that's what courts of law are out there to do what's fair and just, and they are the ultimate arbitrators in this.
Tyler, should they be responsible for paying for everything? They, after all, are taking all the profits.
That opinion belongs to someone with a great deal more legal experience and degrees than I have. I will say, as a journalist, and you understand this as well, that perception is reality, at least public perception. And so I think that your feeling for whether BP has acted responsibly or not thus far really has to do with the images that you hold on to personally from this spill. Is it the huge U.S. advertising campaign that BP rolled out in the wake of the spill? Full-page ads featuring its employees who are from the Gulf and are promising to make this right? Or is it former Chief Tony Hayward saying those infamous words, "I want my life back"? So it really depends on who you are and the memories you have. And it's the court who's going to decide just how responsible BP is or how much is lacking in their payments.
And I'm just wondering whether this became a political issue too early in the process, because, in the immediate aftermath, the administration seemed to wash its hands of any kind of responsibility, because there was a news conference where Robert Gibbs, who was press secretary at the time, was asked, can you not force these companies to do something about this? And he said no.
Well, I would say it was politicized before this spill ever happened. If you look at the partisanship that's in place in Washington right now and has been growing and growing, Washington insiders will tell you, for years now. Think back to the 2008 presidential election and the Republican convention and another set of famous words, drill, baby, drill.
Right.
Domestic oil production, and gas production for that matter as well, have been a partisan issue. Republicans have seized on that we need more domestic production, more of the United States needs to be open for this. And one of the unbelievable coincidences out of all of this is not long before this accident happened, President Obama and the White House unveiled their plan to open more of the outer continental shelf for exploratory drilling.
Let's go to President Obama. This was in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. He came out strongly against those involved and the need for reform in the oil industry. Let's watch.
I will not tolerate more finger-pointing or irresponsibility. Yet executives of BP and Transocean and Halliburton falling over each other to point the finger of blame at somebody else. But it is pretty clear that the system failed, and it failed badly. Permits were too often issued based on little more than assurances of safety from the oil companies. That cannot and will not happen anymore.
Okay, now as for drill, baby, drill, there was a moratorium in place on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, but not anymore. Let's look at this. There are now 40 rigs operating in the Gulf today compared with 25 a year ago. BP itself has 5 of those rigs, the same number it had before the accident. It plans to have a total of 8 in the Gulf by 2013. The U.S. Energy Department estimates that by 2020, oil production will nearly double to 2 million barrels a day from its current level of 1.3 million barrels a day. So it's certainly drill, baby, drill. Randa.
It is. You can't have it both ways. And particularly now when you have $5 a gallon gasoline in some places in America, almost, in places in California. You know, you do have this cry for more domestic production, as if that's going to immediately affect the price of gasoline. It won't. But there is an overall view, and by the way, it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats too, who believe that for the national security interests of America and energy security, you need to have more domestic drilling to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Not knowing, of course, the majority of oil that's imported into the United States comes from Canada and Mexico. And if you want to classify that as foreign oil, that's fine. But if you want to ramp up, you can't have it both ways. If you want more domestic drilling, whether it is onshore, offshore, wherever in the United States, you are going to necessarily have to absorb some of those risks that come with it. And as far as President Obama's words go, the people who issued those permits for the drilling are his employees in the United States government. So to say that you can blame those companies, you know, the government is the one who takes a look at this evidence and decides to issue those drilling permits. It's not issued by the companies themselves.
All right, let's go back to Monique. Monique, earlier on you mentioned criminal liability in this, and I was wondering, you know, can BP be charged with criminal negligence in this case? And what would the charges be? I mean, there were people who were killed in that explosion, but what would the charges be?
Well, we're going to soon find out what those charges will be from brought by the Department of Justice. But it could focus on false statements to the government on the part of BP or any of the other defendants. It could focus on issues of negligence and gross negligence under the Clean Water Act. And there's also this other legal theory of a federal statute that could double the penalty with this criminal prosecution. So that we'll be seeing, I think, in the not too distant future as to what those criminal charges will be if they are indeed brought by the Department of Justice. But it's my understanding that this is something that's in development. So stay tuned. But from where I sit in the Gulf region in the city of New Orleans, the main concern that we have here is our energy insecurity. If you look at any of the maps of oil and gas production taking place in the Gulf of Mexico, you'll see that the Macondo well, where this BP oil drilling disaster occurred, is in very deep waters, and the safety for which is severely lacking. And so our regulatory standards haven't caught up with the circumstances we're now facing with relatively safer processes for oil and gas production and drilling drying up and being depleted. And so we're going to more and more dangerous places and sources for oil and gas, whether it's the very deep offshore oil drilling as BP and Halliburton and Transocean undertook in the Gulf of Mexico, or hydrofracking taking place elsewhere, also in Louisiana, or the tar sands development. What we have here is a real critical question, not just for any president, but for our country, about oil consumption and the ways in which we can be more efficient in our use of it, and how we should be developing renewable energy sources. We can't take more of these kinds of dangerous forays into deep water oil drilling or hydrofracking or tar sands development with these tremendous costs to our health and our environment and our future.
Well, I want to be clear, though, while we're up here and to some extent beating up the U.S. regulatory process for deep water oil exploration, let's realize that the government's biggest concern about a deep water oil spill right now is not within U.S. waters. It's what Cuba is doing off of its coast, which is not regulated by the U.S.
There has been weak regulation in the U.S., though, hasn't there? Well, weak regulation over safety.
I don't know if you would call it weak, Randa.
Yeah, up until last year. And if you talk to Nancy Pelosi, if you look at Nancy Pelosi's press releases, Nancy Pelosi will tell you that Congress passed more legislation on this issue than any other Congress has in history. So up until this point, you're right, the regulations have been weaker. But take a look at the overburdening regulations they passed in the last Congress, some of which is almost impossible to meet. And you may see more in the next Congress.
And the Oil Spill Commission that was appointed by the President, the Federal Spill Commission, co-chairman Bob Graham, former senator from Florida, did say, and the report said itself, that while we're blaming the companies involved for this spill, much of the blame also lies with us, with the government, for lax regulation.
Okay. We are going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the Inside Story team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send us your ideas directly to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.